Welcome to Unlearning Ignorance, a podcast where once a month we discuss a commonly divisive issue and attempt to fairly represent multiple perspectives. We are not experts, nor are we neutral. Our goal is to show an accurate understanding of conflicting sides, in hopes that it will foster civil conversations with an attitude of always learning. But we also want the show to represent you. So every month we will have a response episode where we highlight your comments, emails, tweets, and voicemails, telling us what we got terribly right, incredibly wrong, or something in between. Thanks for listening to this month's episode, where we bring together Vox Populi, the voice of the people.
Welcome, listeners, to another month of Unlearning Ignorance. We thank you for your week-long patience as we settle into our October issue. You know, Ethan was sick, but is feeling all better now. It wasn't COVID, the very thing we were talking about for last month. And we are actually looking at doing things a bit more topically as we finish out the year, doing things that really fit what's happening that month. And as we veer away from COVID onto a more social, kind of light-leaning issue, we're going to be looking at, in today's episode, really one of the most controversial things to come out of the past, I would say, decade or so of popular culture and entertainment, that being the Star Wars sequel trilogy, which caused so much division, a famously kind of vitriolic, toxic fandom. And even when it wasn't toxic, there were still just huge divides of opinion and still, divisive opinions about some of the most successful films of all time. And it's fitting for the month of October 2020, since at the end of the month, we'll be seeing the return of The Mandalorian, one of the most perhaps non-divisive and unifying things currently happening in the Star Wars universe. And so Ethan and I, for today's episode, are prepared to tackle the sequel trilogy from a few different perspectives. So I'll go ahead and say up front that what this is not is just a basic review of the three films. We'll probably get into our own more personal thoughts on the movies when we do a response episode to this topic. And so, of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the movies as well. And we will touch on the bigger pros and cons of why some fans and critics loved or hated these movies. But we will mostly be talking about the controversy that each film created, both different controversies for each movie and of just the overall trajectory and creation of the sequel trilogy. So with that, Ethan, I'll go ahead and throw it over to you.
Well, yeah, that was a lot. We're just going to talk about Star Wars, man.
Or we're just talking about Star Wars. You know, the thing that people do at clubs and cafes and living rooms and malls and
YouTube,
cars
man.
And YouTube.
It is a hotbed for just podcasts, videos. There's so many hot takes, cold takes, medium, meh takes on YouTube.
Yeah,
there's people who stand it, who love it.
There are massively popular YouTubers that have been talking about the sequel trilogy, as well as pretty popular YouTubers who exclusively cover Star Wars, which is kind of incredible. And so you have so many different sources from which to gain information and gain perspective on what the release of these three films looked like, how they were perceived, and a lot of people on those YouTube platforms trying to help bring the fandom together, as much as there are also people that are perhaps actively participating in the tearing apart of the fandom. I'll bring up one person who it's a channel called Mowler that has some of the harshest, most detailed critiques of this film, and probably works as great fuel for the division that has been caused between people who would call themselves Star Wars fans but have completely different opinions about these movies. But I don't think he's trying to cause division. He just has very strong opinions, and he actually has such in-depth detailed critiques of these three movies that his YouTube videos are like 3 hours long. I think he's been working on a review of The Force Awakens that is like 3 different videos that are about 2 or 3 hours long each, which you would think is insane and impossible. So obviously, like, that's not what we're doing in this show, and we want to bring together the different perspectives while also fairly representing those different perspectives. So, you know, we're both coming into this with years of conversations with people, our own different opinions, but
I just love the question, like, why is this important? Like, it's hard to say that because it just feels so internal that I have grown up with Star Wars. Like, Star Wars has been a cultural, like, cornerstone in America the whole time I've been alive. I don't know in America and American cinema culture without a Star Wars.
Right.
And
it's important for, you know, us culturally on some extent just because of how deeply important it is to millions of people in our country. Not to mention the popularity and importance that it also has worldwide. Although, to some extent, unlike Marvel, it is more specifically, you know, the fascination for Star Wars, it kind of has an American hotbed, I think is accurate to say.
For sure.
So
But it is funny that space wizards with laser swords is
How
in
dare you.
it's a mainstream, like,
you
doesn't
forgot
know
to
what they
mention
are.
children's movies about space wizards with laser swords.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Which to some extent is a little inaccurate. I mean, as we get into these 3 movies, they were all PG-13, which there hadn't been a PG-13 Star Wars movie until Revenge of the Sith. So that was supposed to be, you know, the exception to the rule, and then now it has become the rule, which is another interesting question of who exactly are these movies for. You know, I think the people who probably will end up loving these movies the most decades from now are the kids who saw them. That, you know, sure, they needed probably some sort of parental guidance to see them, according to a PG-13 rating. But, you know, they'll be growing up with these characters, loving these characters. For them, you know, Rey, Finn, and Poe will be as normal, if not more so, than Luke, Leia, and Han.
Luke, Han, and Leia. Yeah.
And there are probably, you know, people seeing this movie who don't even really know who Anakin is, and that's
For the best. But
well, and there's an extent to which, you know, they were trying to please, you know, the kids of the current generation and the adults of the current generation who were kids when the prequels came out or kids when the original trilogy came out. So a very huge, basically all ages, you know, was the goal, to bring together 3 different generations of Star Wars fans or potential Star Wars fans with a movie series, you know, a trilogy that is both its own story and connected to the preceding films. So that's a big task, and that's you know, what Disney decided to do when they got rights to the Star Wars franchise. So should we just go ahead and jump into kind of talking about each film one at a time before more of the overall? So I'll go over these really quickly. The Force Awakens, we're going to be going spoiler heavy. Nothing is really off limits in this episode because it would just be too hard to discuss some of these movies without doing so.
Darth Vader dies.
Right. So on a big level, the pros for The Force Awakens were that it brought the franchise back to life with the original cast and a focus on practical effects, rejecting the green screen focus of the prequels. It was a huge crowd pleaser that is, to this day, still the highest grossing domestic film of all time. Even though worldwide it was beat pretty heavily by the Endgame last year, it is still a good 100,000 or 100 million higher US than Endgame. And really the movie, like, according at least to the people who liked The Force Awakens, it had excellent pacing, solid comedy, first-rate effects and music.
Absolutely.
And really to the most extent, won over the majority of crowds and critics. That it is the least divisive of the three films. But it still had its cons, still had its naysayers, with the major cons being...
I mean, it's the same plot as the two of the original movies.
Right, exactly.
You got a big Death Star you got to blow up.
Yeah, so it's derivative. It steals its major story beats from A New Hope. It includes a lot of director J.J. Abrams' trademark mystery boxes, where he set up just a lot of loose ends and unanswered questions and cliffhangers that he would be leaving for other filmmakers and storytellers to have to answer to.
Which I would say are only controversial because of how the next two movies botched the handling, and that those threads might have been able to be like, oh, that's so brilliant. But,
yeah, and we'll get into that, obviously, but it is hilarious to me that that episode 9 was also made by J.J. Abrams, and it doesn't seem like those two movies were made by the same person, because what was started in 7 is not ended in 9. But again, I'm not to get ahead of ourselves. So I would say the main controversy when it comes to episode 7 was kind of the fear behind who was making it, how they were making it, and why. The fear that Disney would turn the Star Wars franchise into a never-ending series of Marvel films, ruining its specialness and its originality. Alongside, and this is really, with that, here, the other major point of controversy with The Force Awakens is that it represented the disposal of all pre-existing non-movie Star Wars material as no longer being canon. So decades worth of video games, novels, comics out the window.
It definitely did start off without, because all that was announced before it even launched. He started off on a sour note going into the theater, which is so funny that controversy started this before the reboot even came out.
Right, and I think we'll get that. That'll be a theme, that the controversy isn't always based in what actually happens in the movie. It's also based in what happens around the movie. And the big thing here is that, we asked that question, who are these movies for? They are not really for the most dedicated fans of Star Wars. They're especially not exclusively for them. The Force Awakens, really none of these movies would have even made $1 billion if these movies were only for the types of really dedicated, in-depth Star Wars fans who have been reading the novels and the comics over the years. Even if every single person who ever played Knights of the Old Republic bought a movie ticket, I don't think that would get us to $1 billion. So there is that extent to which these movies are being made for the lowest common denominator, or the greatest common denominator of Star Wars fans, depending on which way you're looking at it. Trying to get everyone in the door, which will ultimately displease the really dedicated ones. We have plenty of fans who are now really focused on their head canon, their personal head canon, rather than what Disney tells them is canon. Star Wars fans who want to focus on the stories that they want to be the real deal, rather than having to juggle episodes 7, 8, and 9 as this is all I've got.
I would also say, it also doesn't land well with the critics because it feels like they played it really safe. It was a safe story to tell and told to the least controversial audience. And my father, who's not even a hardcore Star Wars fan, he just enjoys the main movies, had a little bit of a sour taste from it, because I came to a movie expecting something new Star Wars.
So why do you think this movie ended up making $2 billion? Why has The Force Awakens, pulled in more ticket money than box office gross? Sorry, I was really stumbling over my words there. than any other film that's ever been released, statewide or
Promise.
stateside. Oh my gosh.
Pure promise. I mean, what's episode 1, The Phantom Menace, had a huge draw, and it was one of the best grossing films for sure at the time.
It was one of the first movies to almost hit $1 billion.
Yeah, and so there was a length of time, a much more substantial, I believe, for that one, between the originals and the prequels. And there was time for hype to be built up. They had new technology. It's going to look great. It was properly hyped. And that's the same for these movies. They had a good amount of time between the last prequel and Disney bought it. Disney buying it brings up this promise of, this huge industry who has done so well with the Marvels. However you feel about Marvel, it's clear they've been successful and there have been at least a few good movies coming out of it, and a large fan base has formed. So they can do that with Marvel. Maybe they can, quote unquote, fix Star Wars. And it's just the hype and promise. We kind of like the extended universe, but you know what? We got new Star Wars, and they got the money behind it. We're not doing fan films or anything. It's going to be a proper new Star Wars with great graphics, good writing, great directing. And that is, to me, why it made so much money.
Yeah, so I agree with you that promise is the answer to that question. But I don't think it's just the promise leading up to 7. I also think it's the promise post 7. It's really the situation where J.J. Abrams' tactic of mystery boxes works the best, where it just seems like anything's possible. And there's so many unanswered questions, and you want to know more, and it's so exciting. And there's not too much to disappoint you yet. There's not really any risks taken yet to really kind of crush you or destroy your fan theories. It is this open world cliffhanger. I can't wait to know what happens next. I'm so glad to be in this universe again. And so I'm convinced that the reason TFA has made so much money, and so much more than its sequels would make, is because of all 3 films, audiences deemed it the most rewatchable. And I think it might actually even be the shortest of the 3. It's almost certainly the best paced of the 3.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
On just a technical filmmaking level. It just it hits the ground and really never stops moving.
Except when it properly slows down to introduce characters and sit with them and good character moments.
But even that is still well paced.
Yeah.
And it's by the numbers, great blockbuster filmmaking.
For sure.
That really was just this massive crowd pleaser. And I've heard of people who went to go see it 7 times in theaters. Which, as we get into the next movies, you had way more people seeing it just kind of once and kind of making up their mind about it. And as you get further into the trilogy, you have less of anything can happen. You have less of that excitement for what's going to come in the future. And this was kind of even true for me back with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I saw Fellowship 3 times in theaters. I saw Two Towers 3 times in theaters. I saw Return of the King once. And, by some measures, Return of the King was the most successful, the most critically acclaimed, the one that won all the Oscars at least.
Is that right? Oh.
So I don't have time to get into all of these. I want to move on to episode 8. But I did take notes in episode 7 of all the loose ends and all of the unanswered questions. And it's crazy. And of course, we can do that differently now than we could have done back in 2015. Because now we can look at the loose ends of The Force Awakens and see that there are things set up that are never properly
paid off.
answered or responded to, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is where some of the overarching controversy of the series comes to. But for savvy, moviegoers back then, you still could have seen like, wow, where is this movie possibly headed? Because we introduced multiple main characters who are all separated, right? Rey has been sent off to go find Luke. We don't know why Luke is a total hermit and has made himself almost impossible to find. We, have left Poe behind with Finn being in a coma.
Yeah.
And really, not knowing much else. We've got Han dead, and it's kind of a mess of a situation with other loose ends that I could get into.
I mean,
if anyone wants to write in and ask for my full list of loose ends and stuff, then maybe we can do it on the response episode. But
I guess I'm not understanding what you mean by loose ends, because all those were, I mean, if not in part, explained by the very next movie within 10 minutes.
Okay, those aren't specifically the loose ends. Those were more the cliffhangers that really separate out the movie in a bunch of different directions.
Yeah.
Like, where could the next movie go if so much is not explained and all of our main characters are separated in different directions? So enter indie filmmaker Rian Johnson, who is the only human being besides George Lucas who has single-handedly written and directed a Star Wars movie, comes in to bring these disparate threads together and take J.J. Abrams' kind of loose ends and mystery boxes and cliffhangers and thread them all into a concise middle movie of a trilogy. With neither of them at this point, neither Abrams or Johnson, really having say over what would end up being done with the story that they're a part of. So, in December 2017, we get The Last Jedi, which I'll quickly, again, go through pros and cons. And this is coming from like a wide scale of opinion, not minor Ethans alone, or really minor Ethans at all at this point. So the general pros of The Last Jedi is that it was a huge risk taker, the most quote unquote art house of any Star Wars film, often cited even by people who don't like it as the most visually beautiful of the series. With almost an undeniably career best performance from Mark Hamill. And according to the site Metacritic, the most critically acclaimed Star Wars film since Empire Strikes Back. And it's also generally considered a wonderful send-off for Carrie Fisher, portraying Leia, who died you're laughing, who died a year before The Last Jedi came out.
Well, because she's in the last movie.
Kind of. Of course, we'll get to that.
We know this.
And
so
that's its own set of issues.
It's hard to say it's a wonderful send-off when she's in the last movie.
Well, at least, I mean, Carrie Fisher's presence in Episode 9 is problematic at best. But when Last Jedi released, it was considered a beautiful send-off.
It would have been a good send-off, yes.
So, cons, it is the longest Star Wars film, with plot elements that are often deemed overly simple, unimportant, or, according to many, nonsensical. It had too much of what audiences considered to be Marvel-like humor, and it had multiple major players killed off in a way that gave no clear trajectory for the third and final film of the trilogy.
There's a Your Mama joke in it. A Your Mama joke.
Great
in a
Your
Star
Mama
Wars
joke.
movie.
So the controversy around this movie, at least as best as I can sum it up, is the backfiring of Abrams' mystery boxes with artistic and story decisions that basically wrecked everyone's fan theories. Accusations of a social justice warrior agenda with a prominence of female and non-white characters. The killing off of the character Luke after reintroducing him with a story far different from what fans wanted or expected, even to the pleasure of actor Mark Hamill himself. The movie was blamed for the financial failure of Solo 6 months later, and the movie caused a notable rift in the fandom, with few movies ever seeing simultaneously both such passionate hatred and passionate love.
Huh. Yeah, it was definitely a risk. If The Force Awakens was the safest play they could have done, they went to the other end of a spectrum and like, you know what? Let's roll the dice on this one.
Well,
Let's
no.
get this indie guy.
I think in a weird way, Rise was an even safer movie than TFA, just not as well done.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, if TFA represented making a very, very safe movie, TLJ represents making a very, very risky movie. And it could have all been wrapped up together by a movie that really straddled those two sides. If Episode 9 could have masterfully balanced safety and risk, then I don't think we'd be having this episode today.
Absolutely.
Or we'd be having an episode only about The Last Jedi. And I joke, but this could be an episode all about the Last Jedi. If maybe if Episode 9 hadn't have been its own wild source of controversy. But TLJ, in and of itself, as a singular movie, was the most controversial of the three. People still bicker about it online. Rian Johnson consistently receives hate on Twitter for it, and actress Kelly Marie Tran received so much hate that she was literally like, she had to leave all social media because of how
that was so sad.
Right.
That sucked. That really sucked.
And so when we mentioned
so much that she was like cut out of the last movie.
Yeah, and when we mentioned like the vitriolic nature of at least a subset of the fandom in the intro of this episode a few minutes ago, so much of that comes down to that, like, The Last Jedi just didn't simply bring out people hating a movie. It brought out people like hating people. And it really showed like people aren't just angry at this piece of art. It does not like fuel like evil hatred within me to really not like a book or a CD. It becomes a different thing when that bleeds over into kind of hatred of the people who made it, and wishing ill upon them. And that's what it became for, at least a small fraction of people who still consider themselves Star Wars fans, ironically.
Yeah. It felt like a violation of their childhood, right? This precious idea of what Star Wars is. And because the first movie was so safe, that same fan base is like, okay, I don't quite know what's happening, but I feel like they're respecting the universe. Like, I feel like it was too respected and mimicked, but they felt like the original trilogy was respected, and that yes, Han died, but he was given this like epic death. Anyway.
Yeah, it was a very respectful death, and to be frank, when you know Harrison Ford's real life attitude towards Star Wars, he wanted that. Yeah. He didn't want to be an 8 and 9, which
he wanted to die in Empire.
Yeah, right.
Which I think that could have worked, but
yeah, he was such a wasted character in 6. It was like, why not?
For sure. For sure. But
wait, so imagine this: kill off Han in Episode 5. Never make Leia and Luke brother and sister, and then they could have ended up together, which might have been the story at some point. But we'll get back to that later, because the original trilogy wasn't very well planned out. Which is obviously true here as well, just with different results.
Yes. So we spent a little bit talking about the hatred. How would you describe the set of like fans of like TLJ lovers? Like, what's like their connection to Star Wars? Where are they coming at? Why do they like The Last Jedi so much?
Yeah, so I've seen it in different places. I have seen people who love The Last Jedi as a film, in a way that they had never really loved a Star Wars movie before. That there are some people where The Last Jedi brought them into a love of a Star Wars film that hadn't happened with the preceding films. And so for those people, you don't really have the weight of the extended universe or other materials, other storylines. And those viewers were probably less concerned with what they thought would happen or what they wanted to happen or how they wanted Luke presented, because they're coming in with fewer expectations and just wanting to see a good story from a good storyteller. And then you have the people who are the massive Star Wars fans who, are deep lovers of episodes 1 through 7. And because there are people out there who at this point really, really love the prequels, which wasn't, people hated the prequels 20 years ago the way that people hate the sequels now. And so it'll be interesting to come back to this and see how these movies age.
There's a weird love coming back for those prequels. I don't quite understand it. I have softened a little bit on my hate, but I would not say I would love them.
I've softened towards 1 and 3. I still think 2 is one of the worst big budget blockbusters ever made, but it's neither here nor there.
It's so coarse. Just gets everywhere.
That's not even one of the worst things, though.
It's so.
But the this is probably a smaller minority of TLJ lovers. But again, it's those who they adore the franchise, they adore the books, and they see in TLJ that there is respect and reference toward the originals, toward the prequels, toward ideas from the extended universe. And then maybe there probably is a group, this hasn't been a very vocal group, but it's definitely out there, of people who partially their love of TLJ is more on that SJW side. You have I don't think that there is an agenda in making The Last Jedi to be some sort of
I'd agree with
we're
that.
just trying to push feminism and push representation, but representation is there and it's awesome. And so you have people who their love of TLJ might come primarily because hey, there's finally Asian women, black men being given really predominant roles.
I think that is the SJW that people are talking about. I think it's almost a side effect of a parallel goal that it was trying to, the statement TLJ was trying to make was the Force is for everybody. It's not just this one family. Rey is a nobody from nobodies. And that happened to coincide with a lot of these, we're going to show other characters, because it's not just this one family that the Force is strong with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And maybe I'm trying to answer your question a little off the cuff, so maybe my answer would look a little different with a bit more thought. But that category could probably be expanded to the people who watched this movie and felt understood, felt represented. And that's not just Asian women relating to Rose. That's also the people out there who felt like nobodies, who consider themselves nobodies, and find something really meaningful in this movie. And again, trying to answer your question off the cuff, I would put a final category of just the people who don't care as much. That there are people who are not crazy about Star Wars, who will never be crazy about Star Wars, but they love seeing just whatever big blockbuster comes out every year at Christmas. And on that level, it's still a crowd pleasing movie. It is not far removed from how well constructed and fun of a movie that The Force Awakens is, and even to some extent that The Rise of Skywalker also is, if you remove yourself from the greater storyline and the amount of weight and importance that people put on the Star Wars mythos.
I will say a little bit pushing back against that argument. It is a little long for a blockbuster. 3 hours is a lot for to ask for those type of moviegoers.
2.5. It barely crosses the 2.5 mark. It is very long. I will say there are probably a lot of people who got bored with it, but I think a lot of people who are casually Star Wars fans and who just generally like Last Jedi as much as the other movies, probably their main complaint is that it was a little slow, it was a little long, some scenes could have been cut.
It feels long. It feels long.
I get that. I don't think so at this point. But again, I don't want this conversation to be heavily marred by my personal thoughts on the movie.
That's fair.
But it's weird. Like, the reason why we're having this episode, I think mostly comes down to, like, The Last Jedi had an effect on people that I've never seen a movie have on people before. Not just a hatred, but like a personal one. Like, to have like this grudge against the filmmakers, or like almost have this vendetta against it. To get angry when it's brought up in conversation.
Yeah. So
where does that come from?
Well, I have seen this phenomenon of, like, The Last Jedi insulted a lot of people. Like, they felt insulted for liking Star Wars. And so it's not just the fact that they were insulted. They felt insulted by some of the prequel movies. Like, Episode 2, like, they got angry. But you're right, it didn't reach the level of, like, vitriol that this one reached. And I think it's because nobody really, like, pushed how much they liked Episode 2. Like, there wasn't this, like, competing fan base for, like, oh, you know what? Episode 2 was, like, a really good piece of cinema. And if you break it down, here's why it's good. It's the fact that they felt insulted and hated the movie so much, but there's this almost, like you said, equal level of, no, that was a great movie. It was stunning visually. It was well told. Like, it had some interesting themes. And they feel that people who hated it, I feel, had to push back against that. Like, no, we're right and y'all are wrong. And this is what we're going to do to combat your liking of this. It's a phenomenon for, like I can relate to Dave Chappelle's stand-up, right? So Dave Chappelle had a 0 Rotten Tomatoes from critics when it first showed up, but it had like a 90% from audience. And so the critics, like, just started lobbying, like, insults, I would say, at the audience for, like, y'all like this because you're hasty, racist bigots against trans people and, like, all the people that Dave might have offended with his stand-up. And when the inverse is true and the critics love it, but audience, like, really, really hate it, I'm trying to think of another one. Nothing comes to mind, but the crowd almost has the same like, pushback, but there's a lot more of them with a lot less, like, to lose. And the critics have a little more to lose, a little more standing, so they can't be, like, vitriolic, but they're not going to totally ruin their reputation. But a lot of the people don't think they have anything to lose by hurling hate at actors, pushing them off of Instagram. And so that competition of the fan base, I feel like some people might have thought, this is an arms race, and if we don't win this war, the next movie could be like TLJ. The next movie...
That is a great point. For critics who liked The Last Jedi, this is just their day job. They go see movies and they write about it, and they tell us whether they liked it or not. But for the people who love Star Wars but hated The Last Jedi, they have this, like, common enemy, right?
Yep.
I think that's a very interesting perspective, because it kind of brings us back to the relational core of this podcast. It's how can we disagree on things but still get along? You know, that was kind of like the core element lacking from Last Jedi discourse. And I think it's because people felt like they had so much to lose, which seems a little ridiculous in a big picture of things. You know, when we talk about, you know, divisive issues, we're not going to have an episode on racism and have, Here are the reasons why racism's good. Here are the reasons why racism's bad. Like, there are things in life that, like, there are hard stances. There is right and wrong. We're not going to present people who are pro-racism. And that seems like a ridiculous comparison to make, but that is, like, Star Wars, I think, is so important to some people, so perhaps core to their identity, that what happened in The Last Jedi really was like in this identity attack, this identity crisis that says, like, this just goes against everything I love, everything I am, everything I believe in. And there's this kind of, there's something to lose in the immediate future. It's episode 9.
Yep.
But in the long term, it's the Star Wars franchise in a whole, and keeping that kind of holy and pure, right? It's almost like, you know, the way that like a religion would react if their holy book was tampered with, right? If Christians or, you know, Muslims had, you know, people trying to, you know, tack on whole new portions of the Quran, or take out, you know, books of the New Testament, there would be uproar. And that's, you know, Last Jedi even talks about the Force as a religion. Like, Star Wars gets treated in some circles almost religion-like.
Absolutely. Another thing, go back, like, they were kind of right in that there was a battle for the soul of 9, and Disney was listening.
Yes.
Like, it wasn't that Disney was putting the earmuffs on. It's like, no, we still want to make a good movie. We're going to sit down and focus and be creative. It's like, no, they were listening to this feedback, and they were reading all.
Yeah.
You should never read the YouTube comments, man. And they were reading the YouTube comments.
And something, a very interesting and important element of that is Carrie Fisher's death. Because there is no way that episode 9 could have been made as planned without her being able to actually be in it. And so what you have happening in that motion from 8 to 9 is these really, really vocal Star Wars fans actually ultimately getting a say in how 9 would turn out, because of completely unrelated circumstances that required that 9 be rewritten from scratch. As we have the firing of original director and co-screenwriter Colin Trevorrow, who had his own script for a version of episode 9 that was supposedly titled Duel of the Fates. Supposedly there is a version out there. There's even, like, you can actually find some really cool YouTube videos of people kind of like telling the story. There's a video on the channel Mr. Sunday Movies that actually kind of animates the overarching plot of what his movie would have been like. And there's a lot of people now who look at that and say, like, this probably would have been a better movie. At least would have been a more unified story that would have made more sense as an ending to 7 and 8. Some people have looked at his ideas and said, you know, people probably would have been so pleased with this version, more or less, that even if it's, like, not that great of a movie, people probably would have been, like, less angry at 8 because 9 did a decent thing with it. But that movie got thrown away. There's different, like, we don't totally know why. I think the most obvious reason is that Leia played a huge part in it, and they couldn't do that anymore. But Colin Trevorrow had also been, like, putting out some kind of, like, critical duds, and so there was less faith in how good of a movie that he would have made. But this is all compared to Rian Johnson having already finished his script way before The Force Awakens came out. Like, his ideas were already moving in a way that he was actually able to request a few things from J.J. Abrams and get Abrams to make a few little tweaks to The Force Awakens to better prep for where he was going in 8 in his movie. And there was just no way to do that with 9, with new screenwriters, bringing J.J. Abrams back to direct, having to figure out a way to deal with Carrie Fisher's absence. And basically, you're right. You now have a studio who is so worried about this empire burning to the ground that their ear was to the ground of the loudest and angriest fans.
And they have a deadline. You can't stop the machine.
And
like,
you have
all
a
this
deadline.
is like, you got to meet the deadline because there's no way we're pushing it. That's going to be way too expensive.
And I want to touch on that really quickly because I think the biggest thing that ruined episode 9 was Disney's classic unwillingness to move the release date. You can hear other Disney filmmakers talk pretty openly about how much Disney's commitment to deadlines kind of thwarts the artistic process. If you watch the behind-the-scenes features of Frozen 2, they talk so much about how the deadline is the most important thing. And so they were animating parts of Frozen 2 before they even had the story figured out. And did you see Frozen 2?
I did.
So there's that whole idea of the voice and kind of like Elsa's hearing this voicing out to her. They were actually like, they were animating the movie and recording the voice acting and working on the story and the songs of this movie before they'd even figured out who or what that voice was or what the purpose of it was. Like there was all these different moving parts and elements that weren't figured out while the movie was being made because they had this deadline to hit. And, you know, looking at that from a 2020 perspective, you know, hindsight is 2020. It's ridiculous because everyone is currently delaying all of their movies. You know, in light of COVID, it turns out having to delay your movie isn't the worst thing in the world, and there are more important things. And you know, the movie will still come out eventually.
I mean, if we're going to touch on COVID, though, there are downstream effects. Like Alamo has closed so many of their movie theaters.
Regal is the main thing we have in my area, and they were reopened for about a month, and now they've closed down again with movies continuing to get delayed. So the whole industry is taking a massive hit. But what I'm saying is like there's perspective in that, you know,
absolutely
with something this massive as firing the director, rewriting the script, losing one of your main actresses. Like you need more time, and they so clearly rushed the making of this movie when taking an extra year or two to actually write and plan it would have made a world of difference. And so what we get with December 2019's ninth film of the series, third of this trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker, is a very entertaining blockbuster with some of the best comedy of the trilogy. It managed to keep Leia in the movie without using CGI to recreate her. It gave a great overall story arc to the Kylo Ren character, and it had a really great, surprising cameo from Harrison Ford. But on the cons side, it received the worst critical reception of the series since episodes 1 and 2. It was very choppily paced, oddly written, sometimes confusing and nonsensical. It brought back the character of Emperor Palpatine without a clear explanation of how it was possible, making the whole film hard to really believe or care about. And it made poor use of multiple sequel trilogy characters for the sake of instead adding in a bunch of new characters, which quite suspiciously were largely cast as Abrams' good friends. And
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, like when you look at like Zori Bliss, played by Kerry Russell, or that one kind of like nameless guy who was one of the Hobbits and he was the main character in Lost. I forget his name. But those are like common Abrams collaborators. Whereas other characters, not only like Rose, which was, you know, who was created by Johnson, but even Abrams' own characters like Maz and Hux really just get poorly used, almost mistreated in this movie. And it's really just a very confusing affair. And I would say the controversy, you know, outside of the already discussed,
we kind of
rewriting the script,
a lot of that controversy.
Is there's a lot of controversy here. Is that it effectively killed off the immediate future of Star Wars films. All the films that Disney were planning on releasing in these next few years were either canceled or delayed, along with some projects just kind of tabled indefinitely. The movie wasn't particularly successful. It still made $1 billion, but it only barely made more money than Toy Story 4. It didn't make more money than Joker. It didn't come close to Endgame. It made only about as much money as Rogue One. And as we mentioned, it was just a clear attempt at fan service. It was safe in a completely different way than The Force Awakens, and it kind of handed something to the angry fans of The Last Jedi, saying, all right, you win, here's what we think you want. And I think the general reaction by a lot of people was, oh dang, what we wanted wasn't nearly as interesting as we thought it would be. And it kind of it thwarted the trajectory of the trilogy, undermining not only The Last Jedi, but even The Force Awakens, proving a lot of fans seemingly correct about their criticism of the whole trilogy, that they didn't have a set plan or overarching story from the start.
Yeah. I mean, that's my biggest criticism, is that it feels improvised. The whole series feels improvised. And like between each movie, like, oh, we set up that it's really important. Her parents are really important in the first movie. Oh, guess what? They're nobody. It's like, oh, that was a good take. Oh, actually, they're somebody. And we're bringing back our main big bad because y'all loved him in the original. Y'all remember how much you loved him, and he's back and better than ever.
Yeah. So
and
that word, remember, it's the most important word about The Rise of Skywalker, because it's less interested in being its own movie and more interested in being a movie that reminds you of past glories, of having callbacks and references and familiar faces and familiar moments. And and it stops being a story and just it's just a piece of popular entertainment. And I want to be clear, it's an entertaining movie. I think its humor holds up better than the other two movies. It's not well paced, but it is very fast paced. So it just zooms by. It never lets you breathe. It also never lets you think, which is kind of
doesn't let you. Is to its benefit.
Yeah, to its benefit, really. Like it, I think more than any other Star Wars movie, it is one that you can turn your brain off, so to speak, and enjoy watching. I think that the question here is whether Star Wars is something where you should be turning your brain off or turning your brain on, which people have different views on.
I don't think it should be fully off, and I think that's an insult to the original Star Wars, because there was some like meaning to the movie. But anyways, I do want to take a step back and say we are calling 9 a failure, even though you said barely, but it still made $1 billion. This movie did not have $1 billion budget. It's not barely breaking even. Okay.
Yeah, it's profiting.
It made a lot of money.
Yeah.
In anybody's measurements, except when you measure it against other Star Wars movies.
Yeah. It's very interesting to track the success of films and how much movies of a franchise make. Because when you look at the grossing of a movie, it's not always how much people like that movie. The success of a movie is also partially based on how much people liked the last one. So how much money a movie makes is going to be both thanks to its own quality and a reaction to the previous film.
Because everything's serialized now.
Yeah. So the lower gross of The Rise of Skywalker does have something to do with The Last Jedi and the amount of people who are just done with the franchise, probably didn't even see Rise because they just don't care anymore. But I think it also has a lot to do with people who just didn't want to see it twice, who all right, they had the same reaction that I did upon watching Return of the King back in 2003, and saying, all right, I know how it ends now. I'm satisfied, I guess.
I guess, yeah. I guess is right. I will have to address my feelings when I watched this movie. I was physically angry. I was huffing and puffing. My wife was so confused when she looked over. It's like, why is your face so contorted? Why are you because I was giving little and grunts to her and muttering things to her da da da.
So I think that brings up an interesting point. Do you think that people have reacted to The Rise of Skywalker the same way, the same kind of physically angry way that so many did to The Last Jedi?
Kind of. I think that's a small subset. I think it's a subset of both the people who had hope that TLJ was going to be pay off. That, oh, these are interesting ideas. I'm not sure about it, but I'm hope it's going to pay off. And then we're immensely disappointed.
Yeah.
I think that's the subset of people who were angry like me, because I'm like, man, I trusted you, and you broke that trust. Just give me the old Star Wars again. Yeah. Whatever.
Right, and there's such a wide range of things to get angry at, and how angry we can get. And I think the idea that Last Jedi felt more personal for a lot of people probably created that better anger. But it's also just very different things to get angry at. I think the type of anger at The Last Jedi is like, how did you make these decisions? And at Tross, it's more, how could you be so dumb?
I will say there are people who watch Tross and like they feel, oh, this is a return back to the original Star Wars.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
And they like the movie. Like the popcorn popping, like blockbuster watching crowd, I think are okay with this movie. They're like, yeah. I'm not going to see it again, like you said. But I didn't. I like the old Star Wars, so I like this one.
I wanted to mention, I think I've seen almost every opinion out there that's possible. From liking all three to loving all three to hating all three. From loving only 7 and 9 to loving only 7 and 8 to loving only 8 and 9. That's the one I'm not sure if I've actually seen that one, but theoretically it's possible it's out there. There's people who really only love 7. I think I've seen people who like love 9 way more than 7 and 8. And at some point it's like, I'm not sure that makes sense, but again, like it's opinions, it's your own experience with the art, and you get to have that, and you get to have your experiences, you get to have your thoughts on it.
For sure.
There ultimately is not a real right and wrong when it comes to, your liking of these movies, your ability to enjoy them when you watch them.
What would you say the majority opinion is of liking, of the top 2 likings? Like which 3 subsets are like? Because what I see is 7 and 8 are liked and 9 is hated. I feel like is one of the top opinions.
I think loving 7, 8, hating 9 is, and loving 7, hating 8, and liking 9 are the most 2 popular.
That's what I see. It's usually, like we said, the most divisive one is The Last Jedi, and depending on where you landed on that, impacts where you land on 9.
Yeah. But I still think, coming out of 9, I think a lot of people were vindicated in this idea that there should have been a better plan. They should have known what they were doing from the start. That would have fixed things. And I really push back on that. I really disagree. Yeah.
Because I totally hold that opinion.
Well, let's unlearn some ignorance here.
What do you got?
So, for one, as I mentioned earlier, there was no grand plan from the start. Mm-hmm. And I mean the start as in 1977. That episodes 4, 5, and 6 were written one by one with, different directors brought in each time. George Lucas generally having, full control over the screenplays, but still kind of figuring out as he went, like, it was not known when he was making 4 that Leia was going to be Luke's sister. There's things that are being figured out along the way and written along the way. And I don't think most Star Wars fans have a problem with that. I think, most lovers of the originals are glad that they got the movies the way they got it. And when you take that logic into... Well, first, you can take the same logic into 1, 2, and 3, which were 3 movies that were extremely meticulously thought out. Lucas knew exactly where he was going with 3 when he made
Yeah.
episode 1, and having that sort of plan did not help the movies be any better. I would still generally pick all 3 sequels over all 3 prequels, and I still think that's probably the predominant view. So when it comes to the sequel trilogy, the reason I'm glad that it didn't have this concise plan is that it allowed individual storytellers and filmmakers to make the story they wanted to make. I guess I kind of have to show my cards at this point. I do really adore The Last Jedi, and I would not have received that movie if there had been a plan. That, like, if Rian Johnson as a singular storyteller wasn't handed the script of Force Awakens and say, hey, write a sequel to this, and do whatever you want to do within the realm of, us giving you the okay and you working it out with our story group, then, like, if some team had just created the whole trilogy from the get-go, and then, yay, I get to write a script to a story that was pre-written and handed to me, then I don't think we would have had like that handoff and that creativity to roll with the punches and to let different artists do their thing. And looking at just how history played out, assuming that Carrie Fisher still would have passed away, the original plan would have had to have been thrown out or changed to some extent. So, like, you can't plan something in 2013 and know that everyone that you need to be healthy and alive and working in 2019 is still going to be there. That's just like, we can't really plan ahead. We can try to, but planning is never perfect.
Yes.
And so just personally, like, as much of a disappointment as Rise was to me personally, I'm so glad everything played out exactly as it did, because The Last Jedi exists in the way it does, and I get to have that movie
Get
forever.
out of here. Stop it. I don't like it. I don't like that. I don't like that. I feel hurt. I do think a plan would have helped. I feel like if they had written at least the big arcs better, because Finn falls flat. Like, Finn has 3 arcs in each movie, and they're all the same. It's, oh, I have to learn to fight for something. Oh, I have to learn to fight for something. Oh, I have to learn to fight for something.
Yeah.
And that's he has 3 of the exact same arcs in each movie, and that is annoying. Sorry.
So I still think his arc in 8 is a refinement of his arc in 7. If 7 is about, like, oh, I'm not going to run away, but I'm going to stick around, his sticking around is very clearly only for Rey. And so what that happens in 8 is he changes from not just caring about Rey to actually caring about the rebellion and the entire cause. That is a reasonable actual arc that I would say becomes redundant in 9, along with just the mistreatment of him as a character, a lot of dumb humor, and effectively giving him a different, like, love interest each movie. Which I could argue also that Rose isn't a love interest in 8, but we don't need to get into that minutia here. It's still, like, by the time they bring in the other stormtrooper in 9, it's like, oh, this is ridiculous.
Yes. Where are we at? Where is this going? Chase, this is Star Wars.
Yeah.
It's very important. I would say it's become less important because of how Disney has handled it.
Yes. I think there is an interesting argument to be made that Star Wars is not as culturally important in 2020 as it was in 2015. It's obviously not the undefeatable box office behemoth that Disney thought it would be. And this sequel trilogy, increasingly with each movie has, caused people to not really think that the new movies being released have much importance. But then we also have the Mandalorian coming out at the end of the month, which
Oh,
if it
Mandalorian.
matches the first season at all, had extreme cultural importance.
Absolutely.
People who can't tell you a thing about the prequels know about Baby Yoda. Like, Baby Yoda is a
Oh, yeah.
landmark of cultural just prescience that is something that every franchise wishes it could touch. Like, most people would die to have something like a Baby Yoda.
Yeah, he got memed into the cultural
Lexicon,
heart of America.
Right. So I do want to bring us around to kind of the most important ending for all of our episodes. How can we be friends? Where does friendship and peaceable disagreement and conversation exist for these people on opposite divides of the Star Wars fandom?
I think it needs to be like grounded in that it is just movies. That there has to be a little distance put, like there's importance to it, and people are allowed to have that importance for themselves. But when they start putting that importance on other people, or putting expectations on other people for differing in liking that importance, it becomes problematic. And you gotta be able to like something without hating somebody else for not liking it.
Yeah.
Like that's got to be an internalized like recognition of something that's precious to me doesn't have to be precious to somebody else.
Yeah.
And from there you can say, okay, let's have a conversation about why I'm right and you're wrong, without taking that out on them.
Yeah.
About why they're saying I'm wrong.
Yeah, and jumping right off of that, when we talked, kind of in categories throughout this episode about different subsets of fans, and so I don't want anyone to feel kind of categorized or bucketed. When we refer to subsets, we're referring to actual people we've interacted with, and so it's like we know they're out there, whether the subset is 2 or 2,000 or 2 million. But we're all still people engaging in the Star Wars franchise, and a subset that I don't think exists are people who passionately hate The Last Jedi but never loved Star Wars at all, right?
Yes.
So like I don't think that exists, because the hatred that came for The Last Jedi, or even the hatred for The Force Awakens, the hatred for Rise, the hatred for the whole trilogy, the hatred for Rogue One that exists, and I am evidence of, just throwing that out there, is it comes from not a place of wanting to hate things, but a place of loving something and being hurt because something that you love is, at least in your opinion, being ruined, being damaged, being messed around with. And so, for someone who loves The Last Jedi and someone who hates The Last Jedi, there is ultimately a love that you have in common. But it's just in this one specific piece of art, for this 2.5 hours, that love results in extremely different expressions and extremely different feelings. But I think if we focus in on the shared love to the franchise, or certain characters, certain elements of these movies, just the general ideas of the mythos and the galaxy far away and the Force, that can give us the sort of common ground that we always want to seek in order to disagree in peaceable, meaningful ways. Because as much as I love some of these movies, I don't mind having conversations with dissenters, as long as it just doesn't become some like hate fest, as long as it doesn't become like them saying cruel things to me or about me, or about the people involved in the movie. And I think it can be hard to do when it feels so personal, but we have to have like that kind of self-control and care to not let things get so personal, to not make it, your life mission to never let Ryan Johnson make another movie, or for him to be, depressed or no career, or never make his theoretical future Star Wars films.
And I think I would like to give a little bone to those people who wanted to push for a different kind of movie after The Last Jedi, and that it is okay to lobby and fight for what you think is a better movie, to give your feedback to a company that you feel like is going a wrong way with a piece of art.
Yeah.
I think you can do that without the hate, without the pushing of an actress off Twitter, without defaming a director for something he did. Like, you can give that back, and you can make it meaningful without those extremes of hatred.
Yeah.
And you got to reject that, because honestly, if you push back against those fringes, because every movement's going to have fringe, every movement's going to have like people who are latching onto something and co-opting it because they got some monkey on their back they have to get off their chest. And so if that same movement that's pushing for a different direction in Star Wars pushes against that fringe element, it can be seen as more noble. It can be seen as more respectable by even the people who disagree with that movement. It's like, okay, y'all are pushing against this hatred, and like, I don't like where y'all are pushing these movies, but I'm okay with your movement because you're not generating this hate. You're fighting against it while pushing for something you think you want to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, the thing you want to see is interesting because, now we can look at The Rise of Skywalker and be like, okay, this is kind of what you clamored for. Is it really what you wanted? And, we can kind of I think we should all be able to come together and admit, like, we don't always know what we want. We don't always know what we would like the most.
Yeah, absolutely.
People largely hated Empire Strikes Back when it came out. It was too dark, too weird, too different.
Yeah, they had this fun, campy blockbuster, and now they have this weird, like intense Star Wars after it.
Yeah.
How do they reconcile that?
And as time went on, you're like, yep, actually, that's the best one. That's my favorite, according to most people.
Yeah.
Which is pretty profound. And there's something good about art that gives you exactly what you want. There's something great about art that gives you what you didn't know you wanted.
Yeah.
And, I think, once we're getting away from this kind of holy grail of the Skywalker saga, I'm hoping that there's room for people to get both, to get the safe films, to get the risky films, to get, whether it's like TV shows or comics or whatever, that kind of cover that whole range of, there are people who just want the comfort food, and they get that. There are people who want the risky, interesting, art housey stuff, and hopefully they'll get that too.
Yeah.
And it's if it does get to a Marvel-like point where Star Wars movies are coming out every year or multiple times a year, hopefully there will be enough where people can be okay. Like, you know what? That one's not for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's okay that it's for you. I don't love it, but you can love it. And, to appreciate the disagreements. I hate The Last Jedi, but I can appreciate why you love it. It is something that would help a lot of a lot of conversations. And I've actually seen it. I have seen in a really great Star Wars Facebook group that I would, if anyone's been reading this conversation or hearing this conversation and wants to get around kind of like good-natured, peaceable Star Wars fans who kind of support your differences and different likes. There's a Facebook group called
Star Wars support group.
Yeah. Well, it's a Star Wars fan group titled The Outer Rim, where I've seen this, and I've seen people just like, they don't allow like the name calling and the hatred, and it's really thoughtful, nice people who just post every now and then funny memes, interesting talking points. But something that I saw happen in The Outer Rim that kind of amazed me is someone who genuinely really didn't like The Last Jedi, but he listened to the entire novelization on audiobook, just to get a better grip on the story, to kind of understand maybe from a bigger perspective what was happening, getting those background details that you can't fit into the movie, but you can fit into a novel. And at the end of it, still didn't really care for it a lot, had a little bit more respect for different details. But how much respect I had for him for, listening to the entire novelization for a movie that he didn't care for at all. That's really impressive. And I kudos to anyone kind of like that who has that much, willingness to try things out, to hear people out. There are some people who hated The Last Jedi and will always hate The Last Jedi. But it makes me sad for the people who hated it so much seeing it the first time that they're never going to see it a second time, that they refuse to watch it again or give it another chance. Because I didn't like it very much on the first time. And then when I saw it the second time with you, it cemented itself as one of my favorite films of all time. It's cool that we waited to talk about Last Jedi until after we had time to really digest Rise of Skywalker. And it's cool that, Mandalorian's about to come out. This is just a fun universe for stories to be told, for characters to be invented, for artists in the visual medium to get to play. So it's a fun thing to talk about, art inspires art. The best of art, even the stuff that, is hated, it gets great conversations going. A movie that's just really, really mediocre, like your standard, run-of-the-mill, rom-com, can't inspire hours worth of podcasts and YouTube videos the way that these movies can. And that says something.
For sure.
So we're happy to add to the conversation, and we hope you'll add to the conversation too. And obviously our little outro segment is about to tell you how you can reach us. But whether it's on Facebook, in our Facebook group, Unlearning Ignorance, or maybe you know us personally and you just reach out or email us, unlearningignorance@gmail.com. We want to hear your feedback on
absolutely
not only your thoughts about this movie, maybe your own reviews of the movie. Maybe you send us letterboxd links to things you wrote about the movie. But also your interactions with people. The worst that you've seen of the Star Wars fandom, the best you've seen of the Star Wars fandom, how you've maybe interacted with loved ones or family or spouse, about disagreements with these movies.
I think that's what I want. I want to see the craziest take and how y'all talk about that. That's what I want to see. So
we'd love to hear from you. We hope you'll hear from you soon. Once we get a decent amount of responses, we'll make a response episode. And Thank you for listening to this month's episode, but the conversation isn't over yet. We want to hear from you. What did we get right or wrong, and what's your perspective on the issue? By writing in, your feedback can be featured in the response episode we will publish later this month. Email us at unlearningignorance@gmail.com, tweet us at unignorancepod, or leave a voicemail at 972-885-9574. Again, that's 972-885-9574. And by lending your voice to the conversation, you can help this podcast represent the Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Thanks for tuning in to Unlearning Ignorance, and we'll be back next month with another divisively divisive issue.